Einen wunderschönen guten
Good morning to
Morgen.
everyone here today, February 14th, 2026, and we welcome Dr. Erwin Annau, The Right to Freedom and Optimal Life. His website is listed below. Visit and you'll learn more about him as well. We're diving right in today, and today's topic is the reality of disaster capitalism.
Wir steigen heute ein und da heißt das Thema heute der Tatbestand.
The current
Disaster
situation.
Capitalism.
Dear Erwin, first of all, good morning to you.
Good morning, Klaus. It's nice to see you.
Yes, I'm glad you're taking the time to talk to me too. Dear Erwin, what really happened? The media is often quick to report things. I call it quick and dirty. In your opinion, what needs to be set straight when it comes to accurate media coverage?
Richtig zu stellen zum Thema richtige Medienberichterstattung.
Ja, da ist sicherlich sehr viel richtig zu
Yes,
stellen.
there's certainly a lot that needs to be set straight. That will take some time. It might take a little longer, but I promise you, it's going to be a really interesting and exciting report about what actually happened at El Paraíso Verde, or at what used to be El Paraíso Verde. I have terminated this project. Today I'll be discussing the elements of the crime and the facts of the case. And I'll read from a script I have written, paragraph by paragraph, and I ask you to interrupt me. You're not a lawyer. You don't have a legal background. You're just someone who tries, just like the people out there, to understand it logically and to question it. As always, any questions or comments are welcome. So I'll try to explain these complex facts now, and then in the next episode we can analyze the actual events. That is, what really happened.
Das, was wirklich geschehen ist, auch analysieren. Also,
So the facts of the case and the circumstances. In order to understand the circumstances, that is, what actually happened, rather than what is being circulated on social media, and to be able to assess those circumstances, or in other words, to reach a judgment, one must first understand the facts of the case. In the criminal code, a crime is defined as a description of specific acts and their subjective motives.
Handlungen und deren subjektiven Motiven. Beispiel. Ich mache das gleich Beispiel.
For example, murder and manslaughter. Murder requires the intent to kill someone. However, this must be proven. Manslaughter can involve a person losing their temper, with the intent to physically harm someone but not to kill them, yet it ends with the death of the victim. So the result is the same: a dead body. The act itself may be the same. However, the severity of the punishment depends on the offender's proven intent. Did he intend to kill or not? Once an offense under the criminal code is deemed to have been committed beyond a reasonable doubt,
Strafgesetzbuch nach Vergleich mit tatsächlichen Handlungen, die passiert sind, und nach Vergleich mit
based
den
on a
Motiven
comparison with the actual acts that occurred and the motives involved, this results in the corresponding legal consequences. The elements of the crime are what are described in the legal tax book. The facts of the case are what actually happened. The role of a criminal court should therefore be to classify the actual facts of a case. That is, the actual acts committed by individuals and their proven intentions under one or more of the standardized definitions of reprehensible acts set forth in criminal law. A lawyer would call that subsuming.
Tatbestände von verwerflichen Handlungen einzuordnen. Das nennt dann der Jurist subsumieren. Habe ich das einigermaßen verständlich rübergebracht?
Did I make that clear enough?
Yes, definitely. I always ask, what is real life and what is fiction? And ultimately, that's where we are, too. On the one hand, we have the law books, which define the legal situation and are based on actions, that is, on what actually happens in real life, the facts of the case, as you just so nicely explained.
Okay, so the problem is that social media speculation is making things even more complicated, and the facts of the case in El Paraíso Verde are already very complicated. That's why I need to first explain what the actual crime is, what exactly was committed here. And only then can we take a closer look in future episodes at what actually happened.
Begangen wurde. Und erst dann können wir in weiteren Sendungen konkret schauen, was ist hier als Sachverhalt passiert.
Lieber Erwin, was ist wirklich passiert im
Erwin, what really happened with the El Paraíso Verde project?
Klaus, the crime committed here is called disaster capitalism. And to understand the situation at El Paraíso Verde, which seems incomprehensible to outsiders, one must first understand which offense is alleged to have been committed at El Paraíso Verde and is still believed to be organized. What I'm about to say might sound a little strange, but we always have to say, presumably. The trolls on social media, who have already committed over 10,000 counts of defamation, clearly don't follow the rules. Of course, everything we say here regarding the possible perpetrators is subject to the presumption of innocence. Everyone must be presumed innocent until they have been convicted by a final judgment in 3 instances. That's how it should be. We are therefore presumably still in the midst of a complex crime. Otherwise, no one can understand why a group of settlers and investors would want to profit from a project that, with over 10,000 instances of defamation, including slanderous comments and videos on YouTube, TikTok, and social media, has been talked down so badly that practically no one has contacted us or moved here in the past 2 years.
Yes, as the media has reported, we know that by now. We are no longer attuned to the reality of media coverage. Erwin, crimes and disaster capitalism. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Exactly. So for me, what's important is that, given what's happening now, since we always want to keep that perspective in mind, can we still salvage the situation? Can we still bring it to a positive conclusion? As I said, we're in the middle of a Hollywood movie, and right now everything's in shambles. The question now is whether we can turn this into a happy ending. In my opinion, possible. It's no problem at all for me. The problem is only being created because what needs to be done first is to fully rehabilitate the project itself and its founders. Otherwise, no one will want to get involved in the future. It's a scorched earth policy. This smear campaign makes no sense. It's financial suicide and the self-destruction of their own home, which we, the founders, have nurtured like a delicate little plant, with love, patience, and a great deal of soul energy. And I deliberately say soul energy, to the point where it has grown into a village of 200 people. El Paraíso Verde was supposed to become a town with 6,000 settlers, where 2,000 Paraguayans would have found work. And El Paraíso Verde is set to lead the region and the country to new heights. But the greed of a few allegedly corrupt individuals has shattered the lifelong dreams of thousands of families and the dream of thousands of people from all over the world to find a new home in Paraguay, in a community built on mutual trust and respect. It has been temporarily destroyed as of today. But as you rightly said, everything can be healed again. And above all, drawing on the experience of the former El Paraíso Verde, everything could be rebuilt from scratch and become even bigger, even more beautiful, and even more successful.
Erwin, what that really means is that the longtime residents, who are now deeply disappointed, want to find hope again. So, dear viewers, listen carefully to find out how you can get back on track.
Mal genau hin, wo der Weg ist, dass ihr wieder in den Flow kommt. So wünsche ich mir es für euch.
Also, ich stehe derzeit wie der Weihnachtsmann vor dem Kamin und ich habe einen...
So right now I'm sort of standing in front of the fireplace like Santa Claus, and I've got a sleigh, complete with Rudy, the red-nosed reindeer, loaded with a gift of up to 108 million in additional investments that could be on the way. So we could finish the project with the real estate developers who planned to develop it, but they have 2 other projects, and if things don't start to make sense around here, the other projects will be carried out with these 108 million, and El Paraíso Verde will remain a wasteland. I don't have to live here. People always think I have to act like the king of Ippy. Nothing but crazy ideas. I don't need anything. But the question now is, can we accommodate all the wonderful people who have come here? If they have a good heart, we can still save them and their homeland. That's what it's all about. But since people don't understand what really happened here, first of all, you need to clearly understand what this is all about. namely the facts of the case, the theoretical description of the criminal acts, and the motives behind them. And this crime is called disaster capitalism. And by the way, I didn't come up with that. The term disaster capitalism comes from political economy
sondern der Begriff Desasterkapitalismus
and became widely known primarily through Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine. This refers to a pattern, not a single instance, but a complex set of legal facts. In fact, the term disaster capitalism is most often applied to countries. In crises, natural disasters, wars, financial crashes, and pandemics, these traumatic situations are exploited in order to quickly push through radical market reforms, privatizations, or the redistribution of wealth. We've already mentioned the most recent major example, COVID, which we're all familiar with. These radical market-oriented reforms and privatizations are being carried out to benefit capital interests and to the detriment of the local population, and also to seize or expropriate foreign investors' investments. That, too, has been done time and again, and it's happening right now. And even though disaster capitalism itself isn't a crime, you can find it in the criminal code. But the specific actions taken under the banner of disaster capitalism are indeed punishable by law. So this is very important. It is a complex offense, and this offense consists of a series of carefully planned criminal acts. These offenses include corruption, bribery, embezzlement, which are fairly serious criminal offenses against a company, such as embezzlement by a managing director, misappropriation of public, private, or company funds, fraud, insider trading, antitrust violations, abuse of office, and human rights violations. Byproducts of these legal violations are sexual abuse of employees,
Kartellabsprachen, Amtsmissbrauch sowie Menschenrechtsverletzungen,
threats, coercion, death threats. All of that comes on top of it. In other words, while the phenomenon can be described in political and economic terms, it only becomes subject to criminal law once the specific criminal offenses involved are identified and singled out. Well, I think it's really interesting that we have a crime here that we first need to break down. And by the way, the OECD has certainly recognized this problem of disaster capitalism and has adopted the following agreement. Now it's all about the states again. The Anti-Bribery Convention, the rules for public procurement, which are guidelines for international procurement processes, and corporate governance standards, that is, standard practices for businesses. The goal has always been to prevent corruption in major international projects. And here we have a major international project, albeit one initiated by the private sector. But unfortunately, exactly what the OECD has tried to curb has happened, with little success. And the UN has also already passed resolutions on this matter. So the goal was to establish external criminal liability. This means that companies can also be sued abroad, and managers can be held personally liable. And the United Nations, or the UN, has also adopted the so-called UN Convention Against Corruption, or UNCAC for short. A global framework has been established primarily to combat corruption in the public sector. In the private sector, this complex phenomenon of disaster capitalism remains largely unknown, even among prosecutors and judges, and can therefore usually be committed with impunity.
OKiTAK. Das ist ein ziemlich uncharmantes Wort, OKiTAK. Ein globales Rahmenwerk geschaffen, mit dem vor allem Korruption im öffentlichen Bereich verfolgt werden soll.
So disaster capitalism in private projects is an international scourge for visionary entrepreneurs. And disaster capitalism among private entrepreneurs is different, and this is really important. You need to understand that. The main difference is that the company's crisis is often planned years in advance and is then deliberately and intentionally brought about in order to ruin the project, in order to usurp it. That is, to take it over and steal it amid the ensuing chaos. And if possible, to shift the blame onto the victims, namely, the founders. That's very important. Unlike in the public sector, where a natural disaster or a planned pandemic or whatever is often used, in the private sector, they engage in disaster capitalism, create the disaster, and to steal things. We did, after all, witness the largest wealth redistribution in human history during this so-called plandemic. But in the private sphere, things are different. This collapse is planned over the course of years, and then deliberately carried out. And when the company goes under, it gets snatched up for free.
Genutzt wird, Disaster Capitalismus zu machen, das Desaster zu kreieren und die Dinge zu stehlen. Wir hatten ja die größte
How do you steal a major disaster capitalism project for free?
I'll call this an absolute resolution for now, and since we already recognize it as such, the relevant laws and judicial structures should also come into effect. That's what I think.
Exactly, but the courts can't make heads or tails of it because it's too complex. They still don't get it. This practice is also referred to as predatory capitalism. Some people know it by that name. Disaster capitalism in private projects is a complex, organized crime. It consists of a combination of the following criminal offenses: breach of trust, fraud, coercion, making dangerous threats, extortion, deception, slander, defamation, damage to credit.
Der Disasterkapitalismus in privaten Projekten ist ein komplexes, organisiertes Verbrechen. Es besteht aus einer Kombination der folgenden Straftatbestände: Untreue, Betrug, Nötigung, gefährliche Drohung, Erpressung, Täuschung, üble Nachrede,
And this type of complex crime can only be carried out by establishing and leading a criminal organization. This cannot be done as a criminal act by a single individual. It has to be planned, meticulously planned and carried out. And because of the complexity and interplay of these many criminal offenses, this particular offense is difficult to detect and prosecute.
Strafdelikte ist dieses Delikt eben schwer zu erkennen und zu verfolgen. Haben wir das so einigermaßen verstanden, Klaus?
Do we understand that more or less, Klaus?
Absolutely, I completely understand that. And that's why the current status of your project is what it is. And as a result, people often can't or won't understand something and are quick to judge. People are often quick to judge by pointing fingers. And for me, what happened here is clear.
That's right. We didn't have that evidence either. And gathering all that evidence was a painstaking task. I came to this country to work on a project of the heart, one where people live together based on mutual benevolence and respect, regardless of religion or worldview. And that worked for 4 or 5 years. And finally, I actually wanted to play guitar here and create things, to create a beautiful, dreamlike landscape, a Venice of South America, with 6,000 happy settlers. And that came to an end by suddenly becoming a mafia hunter, or I don't know, an investigator. I've completely lost track of the career I actually wanted to pursue, the original project, and now we're at a crossroads. Will this project actually get off the ground, or will it fall apart like every other project so far did? But let's take a closer look. To carry out the crime of disaster capitalism, you need 2 groups of perpetrators.
Reden wir mal über Tätergruppe A.
Let's talk about perpetrator group A. This group A of perpetrators must be led by a strategist, by a mastermind, who has a certain understanding of economics and the ability to gain the trust of others and manipulate people. That is a basic requirement. By the way, I've seen this happen in many cases. By now, I know of many instances where it was always the same, and only a very small fraction of Group A, only a very small fraction of the perpetrators in Group A knows what is really going on. Some people may have an inkling, but they don't want to know the details because they have a job, and questioning their superiors would mean losing that job immediately. We have examples of that as well. Employees who discover overbilling, theft, or corruption and wish to report it to the owners are forced into absolute silence through severe threats, including death threats. And we have evidence of this as well. Group A infiltrates the founder's company. They take advantage of the founder's lack of knowledge of the language and the conditions in the country, and quickly gain the founder's complete trust.
Und gewinnen ziemlich rasch das 100%ige Vertrauen der Gründer. Da die Gründer aber keine Ahnung haben, was vorgeht, weil sie die Sprache
But
nicht
since the founders have no idea what's going on, because they don't understand the language, you can easily earn their complete trust by doing a few good deeds and offering quick help with everyday problems. It was exactly the same. I didn't speak any Spanish at all, and we were completely at the mercy of those people, the people here who already know how things work, who are helping us, so to speak. And unfortunately, this is being done here by a small group of settlers, and particularly regrettably in Paraguay as well, who treat the newcomers as, let's put it this way, I'm being quite polite here, and I must also emphasize, 90% of the settlers who come to this country are honest, decent, and wonderful people. But there is a small group of people who say, you know what, I want the 100,000 euros right now, which another German ripped me off 2 years ago. When I first arrived here as a greenhorn, I'm going to get that money back from the first German I come across, and I'm going to demand 200,000 right back from him. And unfortunately, that's not a very ethical way of doing things, because only when you've been cheated do you say, now I have an excuse to cheat on my fellow countrymen. This is not an emotion or an energy either. I won't have anything to do with that. I'd rather go to another country.
Energie, mit der ich etwas zu tun habe, da gehe ich lieber in ein anderes Land.
And unfortunately, that happens very often in Paraguay, but in other countries as well. Unfortunately, this is an international issue. So let's go back. The founders have no idea what's going on. Their language skills are like those of 3-year-olds. They don't know what's going on. By the way, as of October 17th, 2023, my language skills were practically at 20%. That's how much I understood. Now I only understand about 50% of what's being said. And when they start speaking their dialect, Guaranol, that mix of Guarani and Spanish, I don't understand a word. And that's a hurdle. We may have a lot of experience, but if you go to a country, work on a project, and don't speak the local language perfectly, and above all, you don't have a perfect grasp of the legal issues, you get screwed. It's that simple.
I can confirm that. It's similar for me. I haven't quite gotten the hang of combining Guarani with Spanish yet. First, you should learn Spanish, and then move on to Guarani once you have mastered it. And then you really get into the flow and start to understand these different local languages as well. And then you might also start to see patterns where you're being taken advantage of. Many Paraguayans put on a front too. After all, they need to make ends meet. You just have to accept that. And that means they want to make money. And that's perfectly legitimate. That's exactly what you should do. Trust is good, but verification is better.
You can't control anything because you don't understand the damn language.
Exactly.
You don't know nothing, yet you're trying to control everything. No, you have to trust someone who speaks your language, and he says he'll take care of it. And here's the problem. And that's a pretty big deal in Paraguay. They really care about you. They really care. They do a lot of good things until you trust them completely. And that is exactly what Group A is doing. And by the way, if you have a mega project, you're in for a world of trouble. But who cares? I don't care at all about the 15 million in damages.
Ja? Und übrigens, wenn du ein Megaprojekt hast, wirst du mega beschissen. Nur, wen kümmert's? 15 Millionen Schaden kümmert mich überhaupt nicht. Das ist ein Dreivierteljahr Arbeit für mich, den Schaden gut zu machen. Und
that's 9 months of work for me to repair, and that's about it. By the end of 2024, all the damage caused by this alleged criminal gang would have been repaired if it hadn't been for the smear campaign. I told the settlers, but they didn't believe me. I said that if we act together as a group and commit to resolving this, everything will be settled by the end of 2024. But if we work against each other, it will take many years, and there is a risk that the issue will never be resolved. And they didn't listen. Some of them worked against us as founders, and this is the result. And whether it will be saved depends on whether common sense finally prevails. If common sense doesn't come back, the project will fall apart. If common sense finally prevails, hopefully at last, it will just take until the end of 2028. That's what it will take until the issue is resolved. But only if the founders don't lose interest and look for another country. because I don't have to live here. But let's get back to Group A. Group A, that is the perpetrators who have infiltrated the company, they are always strategically organized, and they do a good job of presenting themselves to the outside world over the years. People don't realize that. They pretend doing an excellent job. They help, they build, they solve problems, they are useful, and in doing so, they strengthen trust and ultimately this trust, which then leads to the downfall of the project and its founders, because trust can sometimes be blind. There are so many good examples of situations where help was available. And right at the very end, usually when it's too late. Actually, up until now, always when it was too late. The true nature of the game is revealed. That's always important. Why? The trust is growing after all, and this feeding of the fish, by doing good things, doing lots of good things, and then being able to catch fish really well. This has been perfected in Paraguay. You have to give them credit. I mean, recognition. From the very beginning, Group A has financed itself through overbilling and has embezzled increasing amounts of money with this criminal corruption, which is difficult to detect due to the language barrier. We've seen overbilling time and again throughout the project from the very beginning, but only on a small scale. The items purchased for the project are bought from suppliers at prices higher than their actual market value. And unfortunately, that's the norm in Latin America. And this corruption among officials, that is, among company managers and employees, is further encouraged by suppliers. That's really dangerous. Basically, they offer company executives high commissions if they secure contracts from the very companies those executives are supposed to be working for. And then either the products are purchased at inflated prices or subpar quality is delivered. We have examples of this as well. Maybe we can cover that in another episode. And this corruption is viewed, and here's where it gets insidious, by broad segments of society, not even as a crime, but as a clever and shrewd move, and is even admired. So the gas station attendant asks, "How much should I put on the bill?" And he's happy when he can pocket a little money here and there. And this corruption is so deeply ingrained in the minds of the people here, or in the minds of many people, that they describe it as impressive. Well, to me, as an ordinary person, that's reprehensible, abhorrent, or criminal.
They accept this as a matter of course.
Paraguayans watch in awe as criminals fleece the foreigners. And the stranger is always a millionaire, after all. After all, a stranger is always someone who already has enough. You can steal something from him without regret or hesitation. You often hear locals say, "You have 10 towels." Why do you have 10 towels? You live here alone, so you only need 3. And then every week, a towel goes missing from the cleaning lady.
10 Handtücher. Warum hast du 10 Handtücher? Du lebst ja hier alleine, du brauchst nur 3. Und dann verschwindet jede Woche von der Putzfrau ein Handtuch.
Not all cleaning ladies do that. I always have to point this out. There are honest cleaning ladies. We had those too. But unfortunately, my boss already has enough. That means it's okay. I don't have anything, so I can steal. It's so deeply ingrained in people's minds. And that's something you need to know. And it's not just like that in Paraguay. That's how it is in Africa. That's how it is in South America. That's probably the case in other countries as well. So they regard it as impressive when people realize that the founders, those idiots, get robbed all the time. They find it impressive and admire the criminals for it, that they are, in fact, heinous criminals.
A sense of normality has emerged that should not be accepted.
Exactly. We have the experience now. That means the people who come now can at least ask us, because we've had to develop a keen sense for corruption, and no one can pull the wool over our eyes anymore. But the agitators fail to understand that we should also draw on the experience of the founders, who have already learned the hard way. They want us out of here, and then they'll start from scratch again and fall flat on their faces, which is exactly what we're seeing right now. So right now, the project has fallen flat, and it's not our fault. We had it for so long, but it wasn't until the project was taken away from us that it really fell flat. But we'll get to that in a separate episode. In other words, the leader of Group A pockets the difference from overcharging and passes on part of this loot to the gang members as a gift, hush money, or a loan. That's how it works. The financial erosion of the project is gradually intensified until the first investors and settlers become dissatisfied. Sure, there's always money missing somewhere. You can't explain it, but money is missing somewhere. Because the promised deliverables from the project are no longer being provided, or are being provided only after delays, or only after repeated insistence. And that's something that, of course, when you work 100 hours a week like my wife and I do, to promote products, conduct sales, hold one-on-one meetings, you can't conduct 2,500 interviews with people and perform a forensic audit of the books at the same time. You can't do that. In other words, the trick is to keep the founders, those German idiots. By the way, they called us Neanderthals behind our backs. All the settlers who still go to these perpetrators for advice are called Neanderthals behind their backs. To their face, these people say how great we are, but that's a different subject. Let's stick to the topic. The financial erosion of the project is gradually increasing until the first investors and settlers become dissatisfied. The promised services aren't being provided, so people are dissatisfied. And then comes the next step. Some of the dissatisfied settlers are voicing their discontent publicly. These days, it's pretty common to vent in chats. And then, when you're supposed to make sense of all this madness, you vent your frustration about El Paraíso Verde in a chat, but at the same time, you want someone to buy your property.
Erwin, I can understand the settlers too. It's just that they haven't had the information yet, or don't understand the full picture as you're explaining it here today. I hope they now see the right path and bring El Paraíso Verde back to life. Some people say, no, you're out of the game. Others are open-minded because they look at the matter objectively, and others say, yes, I think this project is great because it has so much potential. And I hope that's where the focus will be.
Da hoffe ich, dass da der Fokus
Aber
wird.
weißt du, was die Leute nicht verstehen?
You know what people don't understand when they think the founders are finished? You know what? I'm a free person. I don't have to do that. They don't understand that the whole project really depends on the founders. Each person came because they know us. And one day you'll have to replace someone like that. But they really think I want to be in charge here. I don't need power. They really think I have to live in Paraguay. They really think I have to steal money here. I don't need to work here. I don't have to be here. And that's where the whole misunderstanding lies. The misunderstanding held by people who think we've taken something away from them. I poured 9,000 million guarani, $1.5 million of money I earned elsewhere, into this project last year. I'll probably never see that money again. And to claim that we stole money is absolute madness. And that's also why I can't talk to people anymore. Because when people are crazy, I tell them they're crazy, and I shouldn't do that. I should be diplomatic, but diplomacy has never been one of my strengths.
Wenn sie wahnsinnig sind, dass sie wahnsinnig sind. Und das sollte ich nicht tun. Ich sollte diplomatisch sein. Aber Diplomatie war noch nie eine meiner Stärken.
But if other people are more diplomatic and better at winning people over, then they naturally have an advantage here. With me, you always know where you are. I say, if someone's a jerk, I'll tell them so. And if he's an idiot, I'll tell him so. And that's not necessarily the best approach. And so it's quite possible that we'll go somewhere else. But then other people will have to take over our role. That means generating that much charisma and that much interest that people make the decision to drop everything and come here, and I haven't met that person yet. But that could still happen, so we remain optimistic as well. But now we've talked about perpetrator group A.
Just one more quick note. We also did part 1, which goes into a bit more detail about Erwin Annau's life. Take a look at that, and you'll find more basic information, including about the person speaking here on your behalf, on our behalf.
Over the course of my career, I have built several companies that have generated more than $15 million in annual revenue. And when I told the settlers that it would take from October 2023 to December 2024, and that all the damage would be repaired, I know what I'm talking about. That wasn't said by just some dreamer, but by someone who can make 15 million in revenue. El Paraíso Verde's average revenue was approximately 15 million annually. It wasn't just the record year of 2022, when we generated 24 million in revenue. So instead of backing the person who has already proven they could make up for this loss within a year, they're siding with some paid agitators and slanderers. As far as I'm concerned, all logic has gone out the window here, so I've come to the conclusion, okay, if you don't want to save this whole thing, then let's just leave it at that. Then those who think they know it all and those paid smear artists will just have to be let into El Paraíso Verde so they can ruin the project they're now allowed to be a part of. We'll just have to let them do their thing. If that's okay, if everyone is fine with that, I don't need to be there. But now we've talked about Group A. Let's talk about Group B. And it's important to note that there doesn't have to be a cooperation between perpetrator Group A and perpetrator Group B. They can also act completely independently of one another. Very often, collaboration begins late in the project in order to complete the act of disaster capitalism, namely the plundering of the project. But most of the time, or quite often, these groups of perpetrators are actually opponents at the outset.
Aber meistens oder oft sind diese Tätergruppen am Anfang sogar Gegner. Jetzt reden wir mal über die Gruppe B.
Now let's talk about Group B. Group B consists of lawyers, real estate sharks, and the media, newspapers, internet bloggers, and so on. Group B makes its money primarily by targeting dissatisfied settlers and investors. In other words, they approach people and promise to get their money back very quickly. And this promise is carried out through an act commonly referred to as extortion, known as blackmail. The reward for this offense, for these lawyers, is first and foremost a hefty legal fee, which is usually collected in full or in large part even before the lawyer begins working on the case. The ultimate reward is the proceeds from the project, which are then distributed among Groups A and B once the founders have left the project. The only thing the people mentioned here, the settlers who are dissatisfied, no longer have a say in is the misappropriation of the project. That way, you can rob projects for free.
So kann man zum Nulltarif Projekte kassieren. Und das ist ja bereits, jeder Paraguayer weiß, wovon ich spreche. Ich nenne jetzt den Namen bewusst nicht.
And every Paraguayan knows exactly what I'm talking about. I'm deliberately not naming names, but this was already successfully pulled off in 2016 with another German expat community and a different project. $5 million was obtained through the sale to a frontman or a company, in this case, a state-owned company. The project has been in ruins ever since. There are two groups of settlers there, 120 people, who are at each other's throats, and no one, not a significant number of people, will ever settle there again. It's a shame, and that's exactly what they want to do here. The settlers who have been exploited for the purposes of Groups A and B do not realize what is happening until the project has been completely hijacked. And of course, they will go away empty-handed. So let's take a closer look at the blackmail. How does it work? The victim, who is a settler, a former settler, or an investor, is advised by their attorney to approach the project's developer, usually a real estate development company, to demand, within a set deadline, the cancellation of the purchase agreement and a refund, typically within a very short time frame, usually just a few days. It goes something like this. They come into my office and say, "Erwin, I've changed my mind. This is crap. I want my money back, and I want it in my account by Friday. And if that money isn't in my account by Friday, I'll ruin your project, and then I'll post videos on YouTube and I'll ruin everything." That's how it works in practice. I've seen it happen countless times. As I said, when you look at it from the outside, you see it for what it is. That's crazy. The real estate developer, in this case, us, naturally rejects that. You can't just buy a property and then change your mind and ultimately demand that the real estate agent returns the money within a few days, just because you're somehow dissatisfied with something. That wouldn't hold up legally. Besides, it would drive the real estate company into bankruptcy, and it would render any real estate development completely meaningless. Try that in Bavaria. Go to a real estate developer's office, if you're even allowed in, and say,
Wenn du irgendwer probiert das einmal in Bayern.
I've changed my mind. I want out of this project. I want my money on Friday. And if that doesn't happen, then I'll make a negative video about you on YouTube and I'll say, you're a bunch of crooks. Just take a look at what's going on in Bavaria. But as I said, anything is possible in Paraguay, the land of opportunity, especially when it comes to corruption. Well, the demand is being enforced, so they're trying to force a buyback through criminal means. This action clearly constitutes extortion and coercion involving a dangerous threat. That is a criminal offense. So once again, we see that the complex criminal offense of disaster capitalism is broken down into individual criminal acts.
Komplexe Strafdelikt des Desasterkapitalismus wird heruntergebrochen auf einzelne Straftaten. Ja, etwas muss ich
Yes,
anmerken.
I must say a few words in justification and defense of those settlers who did that. I'm not angry at all. People think I'm angry. The process of gaining insight and coming to terms with what has happened at any time within an hour could save the whole of El Paraíso Verde. But they are not interested in doing so because the people, those who are stirring things up behind the scenes, they want to steal the project. And that's why they have no interest in reconciliation. I can let it all go because I don't even know if I'll stay here.
Erwin, but I can also understand the investors, that is, the settlers, because they've staked their livelihoods on that venture, and the fact that they're quick to judge and pass judgment just makes sense to me. But today, we want to understand, and I hope that some of the settlers now have a better understanding of the background to the situation. It is, after all, the plan. You could say that.
And people are being used, and I no longer see them as enemies.
Und ich hoffe, dass der Fokus wirklich
Und die Leute
wieder
werden benutzt. Und ich sehe die heute nicht mehr als Feinde an.
Ja.
Ich persönlich
Personally, I'm not going to subject myself to hostility and those kinds of emotions. Yesterday, we had a discussion with the settlers. They all want to solve the problem. They want to bring new people here again. And how do we advertise? And how do we make it interesting? I can't say on the one hand that everything in El Paraíso Verde is terrible, and on the other hand want to bring people here. That doesn't work. And I said that as long as this lie persists, namely the lie that the founders stole something, as long as this lie persists, nothing will change in El Paraíso Verde. It's over. Only when the lie is exposed, and we have everything documented in 5,000 pages of certified documents, we have proven who stole what, when it was stolen, and what was stolen, along with each check number, front and back. You'll just have to imagine it. Here is the body. It's bleeding. Next to it is the perpetrator with the gun. It's still smoking. The perpetrator just stands there, and people come up to him and move on to the next person saying, "It was you, it was you, it was you," while the perpetrator stands there, blowing away the smoke and laughing. And that's the kind of madness that's happening here. You have to understand what's going on here, how far the manipulation, the mind control, has gone.
wie weit das gegangen ist.
Nochmal kurz zusammengefasst, nicht du als Gründer bist der
To summarize briefly, ultimately, it's not you as the founder who is the perpetrator, but rather the underlying structures, which are part of a logically planned and organized scheme.
Exactly. And I lost my fortune here too. I came here with a 7-figure sum, with more than a 1 in front of it. And I've lost that too, if it's lost. We are all victims, so it would be good to make amends. And I said that the project would be saved immediately if people understood, forgave, and looked ahead. And this forgiveness must come from the heart, not just from words. It must be genuine. I can forgive people for what they did to us. And that's huge. I can forgive that any time. I don't have a problem with that at all. But then the question is, how do we make up for the damage? That's another legal question. Forgiveness comes from the heart. Repairing the damage or pursuing those responsible is a different matter altogether. And that's when we'll need to talk it over. But as I said, the comment, and that too, is in defense of these settlers. In El Paraíso Verde, the incident is further complicated by a buyback agreement signed by the alleged main perpetrator, which is not legally enforceable in Paraguay. This buyback statement was made at the time. It must be sorted out in court. They must prove whether the principal perpetrator was aware, at the time this buyback agreement was signed, whether people are never paid or whether he didn't know.
Unter dieser Rückkaufsvereinbarung gewusst hat, dass die Leute nie bezahlt werden oder ob es nicht gewusst hat.
But instead of the criminal justice system treating us, that is, the founders, as key witnesses, because we would be the only ones who might be able to prove that the perpetrator had the intent to defraud at the time this declaration was signed, they bring criminal complaints against us, thereby preventing the actual fraud from being investigated. But anyway, the criminal justice system still has a lot to learn in this area. And this buyback agreement has been signed by the principal offender.
Die Erklärung ist vom Haupttäter unterschrieben zu 100%. Der Haupttäter.
The main perpetrator has personally taken responsibility for ensuring that everyone is paid. We have all the recordings. We recorded everything. The main perpetrator also said that 1/3 of these funds would be invested in cattle, 1/3 in building materials, and 1/3 in the project. The investment in cattle was never conducted. The building materials were stolen. When we took over the project, there was a shortfall of 2.5 million euros in building materials. Those were stolen. And the other third just went toward the project. And that is essentially the legal task, to prove whether this buyback agreement was made in bad faith or whether the main perpetrator actually had complete and utter certainty at that time that he could pay it back. As I said, I won't be investigating more years into the past. I don't even want to bring all these crimes to light anymore, so the perpetrators can sleep soundly. I have no desire to keep playing the mafia hunter here. Not at all. They can rest easy. If the settlers don't take matters into their own hands, help shed light on the situation, or reconcile and look to the future, writing off the damage as a cost of business and moving forward, then this project won't amount to anything either. Okay, so we'll make this buyback agreement the subject of a separate episode, but that would only serve to confuse matters when it comes to understanding the problem of disaster capitalism.
Aber für das Verständnis des Delikts des Desasterkapitalismus würde das eher die Sache nur noch verwirren. Also gehen wir zurück zu unserer ursprünglichen Drohung.
So let's go back to our original thread. The former resident goes to the real estate developer's office, threatens massive consequences and defamation, and says he'll file a criminal complaint against everyone involved, which of course he's only doing if he isn't paid immediately. So he goes to the media, posts a negative video on TikTok and YouTube, and files a criminal complaint. And that constitutes the classic elements of coercion and extortion, as well as slander and defamation, alleging a crime without evidence. For a long time, I had the problem that I had no evidence against the main perpetrator and the group of perpetrators, whom we eventually reported to the police. If I don't have any evidence, I can't say anything. And evidence consists of documents, evidence consists of things that cannot be refuted. And I didn't get all that together until around March or April 2024. I didn't have them before, and I can't fire the head of a company, the CEO, without evidence. Then I have a problem. The bank calls me or sends me a letter saying, "You have just fired the company's president. Please write a report explaining the reasons." And then I have two options. Either I lie, in which case I don't have a bank account, or I tell the truth, in which case I don't have a bank account. So without evidence, there's nothing that can be done. But as I said, the development company is naturally outraged by such demands, refuses to be blackmailed, and the video is then released, which ends up harming the very project from which the former resident or investor wants their money back. Okay, the result? The settler is sawing off the branch he's sitting on with gusto and enthusiasm. The defamation further hinders the development company from buying back the former settler's property or to sell it on, because the negative publicity has permanently damaged its reputation. But it must be said that traumatized victims don't think logically, and shrewd manipulative lawyers naturally have a different agenda, namely to collect fees quickly at the outset and then rob the entire project for free as soon as it goes under because of the smear campaign. That's the goal.
The settler isn't even capable of thinking logically. He may think logically, but he hasn't grasped the bigger picture. He can't really do that after all. Maybe just a few.
Hardly anyone figured it out. A small group of settlers figured it out. They were steadfast too, and that is very, very, very possible that there was, in fact, a group of settlers who saw it. But today I fully understand that people were completely traumatized. When I realized that my so-called brother,
als ich erkannte, dass mein sogenannter Bruder, also der mir gesagt hat, ich lebe, ich sterbe für dich, jederzeit.
the one who always said, I would die for you at any moment. I would give my life for you. I would give my life for the project. I'll do everything I can to make this a success. I practically had a traitor in the house. Judas was the one closest to Jesus. When I realized that, I spent several months thinking about killing myself. Let's talk about being traumatized. For several months, I seriously considered taking my own life. I decided against it because I am responsible for those 356 settlers who invested their life savings. Then I put my suicidal thoughts behind me, but I still had heartaches for 4 months. And then I thought, well, it's fine anyway, because if I have heart pain, God, or whoever comes to get me then, will take me. Anyway, in the morning my heartache was at its worst, and I thought I don't need to kill myself. It will happen automatically when my heart breaks. I've gotten past that too. That's how I see it today. During this 2.5-year libel and slander campaign, we felt still bound by our commitment. But only until September 16th, 2025, we have guaranteed the settlers that everyone would get their money. But when 30 heavily armed military police officers from the anti-drug and counter-terrorism unit robbed our company from us, the business owners, this guarantee was null and void. There are video recordings of that as well. We can show them.
Todos los documentos son en la oficina, no en mi casa privada. ¿No quieres? No hay nada en mi casa, todo es en la oficina y la oficina estaba cerrada.
Exactamente.
No, esa es mi casa privada. ¿Por qué? ¿Por qué?
¿Y para ver?
¿Qué quieres ver?
Doctor, no corresponde. La oficina está al lado.
La oficina
La oficina está atrás.
No,
Pero está cerrada, la puerta está cerrada.
Exactamente, si quieren.
Vos puedes.
Pero qué documentos exactamente para que podamos ayudar.
Las carpetas, todas las carpetas yo necesito.
Pero quiero saber qué documento quieres.
Carpetas
en la oficina de Reggio, ¿no? En tu caso.
Sí, ellos tienen los...
Acciones ilegales.
Esta es la puerta de acceso a la oficina. No.
Pero si vas a... No, porque si vas a sacar, son perdidos para nosotros.
No.
Sí,
Él es responsable judicialmente.
No, porque si está legal, debes que informarnos adelante. Y nunca teníamos ninguna información. Y como...
¿Y estas carpetas son de Reju también? O sea, y eso es lo que yo necesito. Mira, ahí está Reju. Acá hay Reju. Acá hay Reju.
No. Nosotros no podemos trabajar. Ellos quieren cerrar nuestra empresa.
Sí,
porque no podemos, él puede sentar en mi oficina, él va a recibir todas las copias que quiere. No problema, sin problema. Él puede, vamos a poner un escritorio en nuestra oficina. Señor, puedes trabajar, no problema. Vos vas a recibir todas las copias. Todos quieren, no problema. Pero con tu acción ahora estás cerrando esta empresa, no podemos trabajar más. las obligaciones de 400 inversionistas, porque 7 inversionistas están luchando y están destruyendo esta empresa y este proyecto. Este es ilegal, este es no constitucional, este es ilegal.
Then, when 12 settlers took over the company and appointed an illegal administrator, since then, the company has been deliberately driven into bankruptcy over the course of 6 months, and therefore we have withdrawn from our responsibility to ensure that everyone receives their full payment. At the very least, it should have been the victims, the settlers, and not just a small minority who took active steps to put an end to this illegal usurpation, this theft of the company. If we had ended this usurpation after a month, we might still have been able to save it. Now, after 6 months, I don't see any way to save this project. We could start a new project on the ruins of this one. But that will definitely happen without us. We will still be there to offer advice. If someone asks us, we'll help. But we're not going to stand there and promote the project anymore or take the blame for it. We've been doing that for 9 years.
Aber wir werden uns nicht mehr hinstellen und das Projekt bewerben oder für dieses Projekt unseren Kopf hinhalten. Das haben wir 9 Jahre gemacht, unsere kostbare Lebensenergie.
Our precious life energy has been wasted here, wasted on pointless infighting, on pointless negativity, on completely irrational behavior. So let's get back to the topic of disaster capitalism. Of course, these unscrupulous lawyers have no intention of getting their clients' money back. Otherwise, they wouldn't be damaging the very project that is supposed to repay their clients through defamation. That doesn't make sense. The real intention is to steal the project and distribute it. So, naturally, Group B is becoming increasingly organized and is publishing more and more of these damaging videos and newspaper articles, and the lawyers are filing a flood of complaints. They're raking in a lot of fees by promising a quick resolution through pressure. But the exact opposite happens. The real estate company's revenue plummets. In the case of El Paraíso Verde, the drop was 90 to 100%. And any possibility of resale by people influenced by Group B's defamatory statements is made virtually impossible. It is no longer possible to sell the properties because the public views the project as a scam, which is crazy because an object can't cheat on anyone.
Das Projekt in den Augen der Öffentlichkeit als Betrug eingestuft wird. Was ja auch wieder ein Wahnsinn ist, weil ein Objekt kann nicht jemanden betrügen.
So, at this stage, these groups are not yet working together. For this reason, the lawyers of Group B may also file charges against the perpetrators in Group A or the principal perpetrator. But above all, they are targeting the founders, who, with good intentions, stuck their necks out and took a public stand and labeled the founders as fraudsters and criminals without any evidence. And now it gets absurd. Interestingly, they're calling the project a scam, which is actually impossible. A project is an object, that is, a thing, an item. A thing cannot deceive anyone. Only a person can cheat on someone. A knife has never jumped out of a drawer and stabbed anyone. That's never happened before. There was always someone in the middle. In other words, the media is all over this, claiming that El Paraíso Verde is a scam. That's madness at its finest. That's just crazy. Nonsense.
Medienhetze spricht davon, El Paraíso Verde ist ein Betrug. Das ist Irrsinn vom Feinsten. Das ist Irrsinn von der Sache her. Blödsinn, ja. Aber die Menschen schnallen es nicht.
But people just don't get it. A project is not a scam. We have to find the person. We have to find the one who took the knife from the drawer and stabbed the other person. But don't blame the knife. Then you realize how they're apparently being subjected to some kind of lobotomy. I don't know what, maybe toxins, chemtrails, vaccinations, a total lobotomy. That's a lobotomy. It's absolute madness.
Lobotomie, das ist eine Lobotomie, es ist absoluter Irrsinn. Ne?
Erwin, ich sag dir ehrlich, wir arbeiten jetzt.
Erwin, to be honest, we've been working together for a few weeks now. I'm getting a better sense of the background and what goes on behind the scenes. I'll admit, I used to think you were a fraud. I thought that because the media had manipulated me into thinking that, and so had the settlers. I had actually been in touch with one or two of them before, but of course, once we got together, I didn't keep in touch with the settlers anymore. But I also understand how the whole thing had affected me. These days, I take a different look behind the scenes. Thank you for the information.
Yes, just ask that question. Where is the proof? When someone tells you something. Let me give you an example. Social media is abuzz with rumors that Annau stole 90 million euros and transferred it to Cyprus to his accounts, or rather in a suitcase, a cash-filled suitcase, taken to Argentina. And there's supposedly a room in car coupe that is absolutely packed with cash. So years ago I said that anyone who finds my accounts in Cyprus would get half of the money that's there. Anyone who finds a suitcase, not in Berlin, but in Argentina, somewhere in Buenos Aires, gets half. And anyone who finds the room in car coupe that's full of money also gets half. No one has come yet. And the problem is that people believe everything. So, as a species, we haven't really moved beyond witch trials. The ugliest woman in the village is screaming about the prettiest woman in the village. She's a witch. And already she's burning.
Die hässlichste im Dorf schreit über die schönste im Dorf, sie ist eine Hexe. Und schon brennt sie. Wir sind überhaupt nicht darüber hinausgekommen. Eine einzige Frage deinerseits lässt die Leute verstummen. Ja?
We haven't made any progress at all. Just one question from you is enough to silence people. Where's the proof?
That's often missing, and I can really relate to that. It's the same with the vaccine, just as the Spanish government tried to isolate a virus. That's not possible. And yet, the fantasy story kept on going. Today, we're seeing court rulings, official ones, that confirm all of this, that we've been led down the wrong path.
Exactly. And that's why I say we've undergone a lobotomy induced by the media over the past 5 years. And what's happening here is really quite sad. In any case, at El Paraíso Verde, the madness that ensued is unbelievable.
15 Millionen Schaden wieder gut zu machen. Ein Jahr. Das Projekt könnte heute...
It's a piece of cake for me to make up for 15 million in damages. 1 year. The project could have 100 million gained as of today. It could be finished today, or almost finished. Anyone who owns property here might have sold it long ago. And now I'm trying again. The 6th attempt, because the first 5 were ruined. 5 were ruined by the trolls. Among other things, I once had a very wealthy person here who would have invested 70 million here. And the settlers simply talked it down at the bakery. Don't invest here, it's a scam. What they didn't realize was that the woman they spoke with was considering investing 70 million here, and 5 were completely ruined. The 6th rescue attempt, in which I would have made a profit of $22 million for this project, and used the entire profit to buy back people's accounts, investments, silent partnerships, and properties. Half of it has already been destroyed. Now, if I'm lucky, if the settlers really do manage to pull it off, I might still be able to save 11 million. The 22 million is no longer realistic. That means the people who own property here, if they have to sell it themselves, good luck with that. But the others, those who have accounts here, who have silent partnerships here, who have invested in the cattle, we can still pay them back, if reason prevails. And we'll see about that. In any case, the project was ultimately ruined here due to people's lack of understanding. And I'm not angry with them at all. Not in the least. Being angry, I won't let that kind of energy get to me. I mean, I don't know, people haven't even figured out who I am yet. But if you compare the project to a chicken, it's absurd. The absurdity of the actors, the participants, and the justice system can only be understood if you compare it to a chicken. You can't cut off a chicken's head, rip out its heart, and then expect it to keep running around the yard and lay eggs. And that's exactly what was done at El Paraíso Verde. And the founder and visionary, the head of the organization, and the foundress, the heart and soul of it, were driven out by an illegally appointed administrator accompanied by 30 army personnel armed with machine guns. And that's unbelievable. And of course, the media landscape here is driving me crazy. You work in media, and this will likely be relevant to your field and be of great interest to you. After all, in theory, one is presumed innocent until a final, legally binding conviction is handed down. But these days, judgments are no longer handed down by courts, but by Facebook and the like. It is an illusion to believe that the presumption of innocence still plays a role today. You know, you always have to say that Mr. So-and-so is presumed innocent. And even if he is convicted but has filed an appeal, it must always be stated. Well, the public sector still does that. Mr. So-and-so is presumed innocent. Take, for example, former Justice Minister Strasser, who was later convicted of corruption. He was then convicted in the first instance. He was the Austrian Minister of Justice. Then they had to state the presumption of innocence. But nobody says that anymore. These days, people get judged by Facebook and the like, without a hearing, without hearing the other side, audiatur et altera pars, hearing the other side, without trials.
Unschuldsvermutung. Das wird aber heute nicht mehr gesagt. Man wird heute von Facebook und Co. verurteilt. Ohne Anhörung der Gegenseite, audiatur et altera pars, die andere Seite hören, ohne Prozesse.
Today, it's basically the internet version of the medieval witch trials. Witch Hunt 2.0.
I'd like to add one more point on that. It's simply not being checked, done, or carried out. Today, we also have AI systems that spread so much fake news, and who checks that? You can figure that out for yourselves. We need to get back into the mainstream media, and that's exactly what OKiTALK does. We want to do live streams, which means it's real, and then we can apologize if we happen to say something wrong. But the reality is, life is always now. Thank you.
And the lawyers for the victims, these victims, the settlers, can, of course, make dozens of videos portraying the reasons as fraudulent and the project as a scam. No one seems to care that these publications make no mention of the presumption of innocence. I still remember when, back in 1993, a newspaper, it was Cash Flow at the time, which has since gone bankrupt, published an 11-page article about me, full of lies, completely fabricated and untrue. 600 police officers were deployed in Austria. It was published on Friday, and on Sunday, 600 police officers across Austria collected the magazine at newsstands. It had to be scrapped, and a positive article about me had to be published. Back then, there was also a public prosecutor's office dedicated to media offenses, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so we went there and said, here's the article, here's the evidence, this is false. And that practice was still around in the 1990s, but unfortunately it no longer exists on the internet. And that's why the Paraíso Verde project is currently on hold. It's a wasteland at the moment. But the value of the project, the vision, and the positive energy have not been lost. And that's important. The positive energy of roughly half the settlers and their vision haven't died out. In this case, we still have the opportunity to undertake a project worth well over $100 million, because we've already brought in $100 million and created 1,000 jobs. We have brought in millions of dollars in assets from immigrants and investors, and there is still a chance to salvage the situation. But let's get back to our disaster capitalism. In the final phase, groups A and B often work together. They pull off a coup, take over the project, and sell it at a bargain price to a third party, a front man, who then purchases it in good faith. A few lawyers and the main perpetrators are making millions, while the victims helped the perpetrators carry out the crime. The victims who helped the perpetrators carry out the crime, you have to think carefully about this. The victims helped the perpetrators carry out the crime, and they only realize this very late, that they won't get anything anymore, and they've lost everything. But realizing this too late is of no use. It's gone. There's still a chance that it won't be gone. This heinous crime only reveals its true nature at the very end, when the investors who have been the most vocal opponents of the project realize that they have simply been used. They are victims who, for the most part, unwittingly became accomplices, yet they are left as victims having lost all their life savings. Very few prosecutors around the world are familiar with this complex crime. In the background, other crimes are usually being committed, but they never come to light. Crimes of extortion, coercion, murder caused by a moped accident or slashed brake lines on cars, the crime of sexual exploitation of employees, organized theft, misuse of company resources such as personnel, materials, and machinery for the personal use of the gang or the gang leader. That's the truth. That's how it happens. There's proof for everything.
Organisierter Diebstahl, Benutzung von Unternehmensressourcen wie Personal, Material und Maschinen für private Zwecke der Bande oder des Chefs der Bande. Das ist die Wahrheit, so passiert's. Es gibt für all das gibt's Beweise, aber weißt du was? Ich will das gar nicht mehr.
But you know what? I don't even want to get to the bottom of it anymore. I will not do the work of the Public Prosecutor's Office or the Paraguayan government. The perpetrators can all sleep soundly. They'll all get away with their crimes because I've taken care of things here on my own. I'll only step in if it's explicitly requested, and then we'll see if we can salvage the situation. But it doesn't have to be that way. I can easily live somewhere else. Let's talk about the people pulling the strings behind these folks. The people pulling the strings are usually the ones who always get away with the loot, unpunished. Many of these perpetrators are politicians, for example. There is no evidence. At most, there is some circumstantial evidence, nothing concrete. There may be circumstantial evidence based on increases in politicians' wealth. There are elections that have been won. We know that votes cost money, especially in Paraguay. The politicians come to visit, sit there, smile, and leave. But the foot soldiers, that is, the main perpetrators in Group A, do the dirty work and hand over the protection money. The politicians and the people pulling the strings can always sleep soundly, and I'm not going to wake them up either. That's not my mission in life. Meanwhile, the frontline soldier orchestrates everything so that the victims destroy one another. The loot has been bagged, and it's always safe with these people. After all, they have the right connections in the justice system, so nothing happens to them. Nothing happens to them. Let's talk about the crime scene. The crime of disaster capitalism is rampant internationally in almost every major project. I have examples from South Africa to Canada, from Brazil to Costa Rica, from the Philippines to Thailand, all the way to Germany. Dozens of crime scenes where this happened. Exactly the same as here. I've even met a dozen people who themselves, or whose parents, grandparents, or close friends have fallen victim to disaster capitalism. In all cases, hopefully not in El Paraíso Verde, they were successful. In Paraguay, this crime was likely committed successfully and with impunity in nearly all similar large-scale projects. I have information from the grandson of the founder of a Japanese colony, who reports similar incidents. When it comes to Nueva Germania, I don't know much about it, just that the project ran into trouble and the founder took his own life. The crime was definitely carried out successfully in a German colony in 2016, so the success rate is 100%. The perpetrators have always gotten away with the loot from a multi-million-dollar project unpunished because prosecutors failed to recognize the complexity of the crime and thus the elements of the offense due to the lack of a definition in the statutes. And the victims always lost all their life savings. Marriages fell apart, and people were plunged into despair. Some people have taken their own lives, 2 of them here, or have become ill due to emotional distress. We've had a few cases of cancer here, and in some of those other projects, the founder ended up in prison for the perpetrators. That, too, was done, and often the perpetrators were the ones bringing the charges. Well, people in Paraguay know which projects I'm talking about. I don't need to go into any more detail. The damage to Paraguay, let's talk about the damage to the country of Paraguay.
Der Schaden für Paraguay, reden wir mal vom Schaden für das Land Paraguay. Der geht in die Multimilliarden.
Amounts to tens of billions of dollars in financial losses for Paraguay. Reputational damage in 2016. When we first came here, there were practically no websites or Telegram channels under the title Paraguay fraud. If you search for Paraguay fraud, you'll find websites and Telegram channels dedicated to the damage caused by this group of scammers and, of course, the greatest damage: the loss of potential investors and the loss of entrepreneurs capable of carrying out large-scale projects. I'm bringing people on board for this project. Or I could bring in people who have successfully led major projects elsewhere, and they always say you're crazy in Paraguay. Doing a project in that environment is madness. I have to agree with that today too. Therefore, all we can do is try to put an end to the madness in Paraguay. If this madness surrounding the El Paraíso Verde project were to come to an end, it could improve Paraguay's overall image. But that is a political task for which I am no longer available. A $100 million project like El Paraíso Verde, ruined by the situation with Paraguay disaster capitalism, which is tacitly tolerated and supported by politicians, causes billions in damage to the country's economy by allowing disaster capitalists to operate with the protection of politicians.
Volkswirtschaft des Landes, indem man Disasterkapitalisten mit dem Schutz der Politiker operieren lässt.
Thus, the founders are the victims. Founders are visionaries, pioneers, doers, people who make a difference, people with persuasiveness, drive, a problem-solving mindset, and charisma. Otherwise, you won't be able to carry out your project. In other words, they are creative beings. What is a creator? A creator is someone who makes something out of nothing. Unlike a politician, for example, who makes nothing out of something. And in every case of disaster capitalism I know of, the founders little or no knowledge of the local language, no knowledge of the country's laws, little knowledge of the country's customs, and no political connections, aside from the political ties of the main perpetrators. That's important too. This allows the perpetrators to erect a wall of language and ignorance of the circumstances, behind which they can operate virtually unhindered and meticulously plan and carry out their crimes. By the time the prosecutor tracks down the criminals, it's usually too late. True founders are very rare, and people with a founding spirit are very rare. Otherwise, we would have many more cities in the world and many more settlements. Paraguay is therefore well on its way from being a country that was largely developed by entrepreneurs from abroad to becoming a country where entrepreneurs are definitely no longer active. Because in this country, every project over the past 80 years has been stolen with impunity by disaster capitalists. The question is, will anyone even come to this country anymore to undertake a major development project? Let me summarize. The founders, unfamiliar with the language of local customs and, in most cases, unaware of the political connections of the main perpetrator, fail to recognize the situation until it is too late, especially since placing complete trust in the main perpetrator, which clouds one's judgment. And this is made even more difficult when the main perpetrator possesses exceptional manipulative skills and has a carefully cultivated reputation and political networks. Other groups of victims include the settlers. Most of the time, they don't know who to believe. It is no longer possible to clearly distinguish between fact, opinion, and rumor. Some stay out of it, some remain impartial. How can I remain impartial and stay out of it when I've invested my life savings in this project? But as I said, reason is something we haven't been able to find here for a long time. This inaction is, in fact, a form of unwitting complicity, because only decisive action against the perpetrators can prevent the disaster. And investors lose their investment because negative media coverage causes its value to plummet to nearly zero. Former settlers and investors are also victims. They want their money back. But some of these former settlers are ruining the project's reputation. As a result, the others who did not participate in the land grab can no longer sell their properties and will not be paid the money they are owed. The active opponents of this project, some of whom are being paid, fly into a blind rage against the project and its founders. They dismiss any evidence that does not fit their narrative or worldview. And they'd rather destroy, this is where it gets bad, They'd rather destroy their own fortunes than admit they were wrong. That's as far as it goes. That's where I lose it. Before admitting they were wrong, they would rather destroy their own fortune. They could just go up to me and say, "Erwin, you know what? We screwed up." They could say that, and then Erwin could say, "You know what? I screwed up too." Then we could give each other a big hug, and then we could come together and say, "Well, we can get ourselves out of this mess. We are creators. Everything that has ever been done can be undone. No, even done better. With the experience gained from past misfortunes, we can turn them into something even greater.
Umgetan werden. Nein, noch besser. Man kann aus
Something even more beautiful, something even grander, something even more wonderful. That's evolution, after all. Experience is the essence of human evolution. Anyway, we'll cover that in a separate episode. But to make use of evolution, to make use of that bad experience, to make something even more beautiful, that's something one could do. But unfortunately, people are still acting irrationally at the moment, and that's ultimately very bad, especially when some people, and this has already happened, call for my murder.
Und das ist letztendlich ganz schlimm, vor allem wenn dann noch einige, und das ist auch schon passiert, zum Mord an mir.
I'd say that crosses a line. That's a criminal offense, after all. And I think that by then, at the latest, people should be able to think with some degree of reason and say, "And now enough of this madness. Let's try to reach a consensus. Let's try to work this out together." But you can see how they're stirring things up, how they're dehumanizing the founders. It works the same way here as it did with the Jews. If this kind of incitement continues, and if it isn't stopped, people will be dehumanized. And in the end, any action taken against these dehumanized people, or this group of people, is justified. So what that means is, if you look at the facts, if you understand that the victims here become perpetrators without even realizing it, when you realize that there are two groups in this disaster capitalism, when one realizes that the victims were incited and manipulated by the leader of Group A, and that they are further radicalized by the detractors of Group B, and once you understand that, you realize that we are now on the threshold, that either the big heist succeeds again, and the perpetrators run off with the loot, the victims lose everything. The victims end up getting the short end of the stick, while the perpetrators have better lawyers. They're the ones who stole the money, so they're the ones who can afford the lawyers. The victims no longer have the money, the perpetrators do. They have the better lawyers and better security. In other words, if you understand what I have just explained, then we have grasped the facts of the case. And only once we understand the facts can we understand the situation. And only then does everything that happened here start to make sense. Otherwise, there's no point. And only then can we speak of salvation and healing. Will everything turn out all right? Yes, everything can turn out well. But from my perspective, things don't have to turn out well anymore. It will turn out depending on how those involved here behave in the future. I am open to everyone. I am willing to reconcile with anyone and everyone, provided that the reconciliation is not just for show, but comes from the heart. I have acknowledged the things for which I can be held responsible. People can blame me for a lot of things: naivety, trust. People can accuse me of not seeing things. People can accuse me of having trusted people for too long. What we cannot be blamed are criminal acts. Everything I did to save the project. We'll explain that in more detail in future episodes. That's exactly right. I'll answer every question. We didn't do anything to benefit ourselves. On the contrary, I've sacrificed nearly 10 years of my life here. I could have done other things during that time. I could have made so much money somewhere else. I don't need this. We have sacrificed a great deal. We have also worked off our karmic debt here. And now it's time to look ahead and figure this out. Let's make sure that this experience gives rise to something even greater.
Ganz im Gegenteil, ich habe fast 10 Jahre meines Lebens hier geopfert. In der Zeit hätte ich andere Dinge tun können. Ich hätte woanders so viel Geld verdienen können. Ich brauche das hier nicht. Wir haben sehr viel geopfert. Wir haben auch unsere karmische Last hier abgearbeitet. Und jetzt geht es darum,
Even more beautiful, even better, even more amazing, and even more wonderful. Yes or no? The decision isn't entirely up to me. The decision depends on everyone involved.
Ja oder nein? Die Entscheidung ist nicht meine allein. Die Entscheidung hängt von allen Beteiligten ab.
Yes, Dr. Erwin Annau, the right to freedom and an optimal life is his motto. I'm curious to see what the next topics we're preparing have in store for us. I don't think Dr. Erwin Annau is the kind of person who would undertake a project just to deliberately bring about this situation. That wouldn't be smart. That is why I have complete confidence in you, which I would like to express to you once again today. And I hope that the settlers will also come to realize this and that they might start working together more and making their voices heard behind the scenes so that perhaps something can still be saved. What is often seen today may be beyond saving, but I think hope is always the last thing to die.
Erscheinen, dass man vielleicht doch noch was retten kann, was vielleicht heute oft gesehen wird, nicht zu retten ist. Aber die Hoffnung stirbt immer, finde ich, zuletzt.
Thank you, dear Erwin.
So at least that's some reassurance, since so many people are panicking, that we want to perform here again as the King and Queen of El Paraíso Verde. I don't need that. I don't need recognition. I don't need praise. I don't need power. The people who accuse us most loudly of wanting to seize power here are the people who want to seize power. People don't get it. In theory, they know it. Apparently, they're all just a bunch of woke settlers. Theoretically, they understand that the person shouting the loudest about fraud is the fraudster. The one who shouts the loudest that they want power is the one who actually wants power. In theory, they know it. But when it comes to their own lives, they don't understand it.
And yet, it's still okay to offer praise. I actually think it's very important because not everyone does what you do, and that takes strength and courage too. And of course, as you know from my experience with OKiTALK, people always like to throw a wrench in the works or throw a spanner in the works. And I always say, the stones are there to help us walk properly again. I'll say it, we need to focus on solutions. And you're trying to get to the heart of the matter here too. I think it's beautiful. Thank you for today, dear Erwin. Maybe a few closing words for you.
Yeah, well, as I said, we're on our own here. We have no personal animosity toward these gentlemen, who have been dehumanizing us, slandering us, and dragging us through the mud for 2.5 years now. We don't hold any grudges, but they have to make a decision now. Do they intend to continue behaving this way? And will El Paraíso Verde then be reduced to scorched earth forever? Or do you want to create something new, based on the experiences you've had? Can you admit that you're wrong? Can you put your ego aside, swallow your pride, and admit that you screwed up? Is that possible? Or is ego and the need to be right more important? It's a learning process, and I'm really curious to see if anything changes here.
Ob hier sich etwas ändert.
Ich bin auch gespannt. Ich schaue positiv in die Zukunft.
I'm excited too. I'm optimistic about the future and hope that we can make this project work and we may bring it back to the forefront. It's up to you, dear settlers. Let's try to find the focus so that something new can and is allowed to emerge again. Thank you, dear Erwin.
All the best. See you next time, when we'll go into more detail.
See you then.
Okay.
Bis dahin.
Gut.